My name is Amit, Director of the Partnership on the Israeli side, the partnership between Yoav and Lehigh Valley, a Jewish agency program since 2012. And this is the first time that we're doing Zikaron Basalon on Zoom. Usually in a normal year, we would be sitting face-to-face inside a living room. But actually this way we can be together even though we're on different sides of the world. And I'm very moved. I don't want to say excited, but I already feel that this is going to be a very special evening. The format is that we will first hear Eva Derby speak for about 25 minutes. We have a musical, two musical songs in the middle, and then we'll have a discussion. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those joining us from Israel. We're very happy that we can do this together. We were Amit approached us about doing this program in honor of International Holocaust Memorial Day, which is observed on the 27th of January each year, which commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz. Was instituted by the United Nations several years ago. And today we're going to hear a survivor story who will be presented to us by Eva Derby. Eva is sort of a newcomer to the Lehigh Valley, but she has established herself as one of the pillars of our community very quickly. And Eva generously speaks, relates her story whenever I call her and whenever she's here, and has spoken to probably hundreds of high school and middle school students in the Lehigh Valley itself, not to mention the numbers of people that she's shared her story with over the years. So I will be sharing my screen that will have a PowerPoint as Eva talks. Although I will let her speak first before I do that. If you want to see just Eva and not the PowerPoint, you can switch your view, but otherwise you'll hear Eva and see her PowerPoint as she's speaking. Eva, we welcome you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here with you. And let me just begin by saying that I'm a child survivor. I was born in 1942 in Czechoslovakia, and I never spoke about my experiences, nor did my mother, until 1998. And it happened in a very strange way. We were living in St. Louis, and my husband was being honored because he was president of the Hebrew high school our children attended. And he questioned Albert, and Albert said, I was born in Belgium. We were able to get out and lived in Morocco, et cetera, et cetera. And then the rabbi turned to me and he said, Eva, you were born in New York, because obviously I have no accent. And I said, you're right. And my husband said, you're wrong. Eva was born in Czechoslovakia and was a hidden child. And so my story, so to speak, became the focus of that dinner. My mother never spoke about the Holocaust until 1988, 3 months prior to her death. So what I'm going to share with you now is what I feel my obligation is to speak, because I'm 79 and I'm probably among the youngest, oldest, however you want to put it, of survivors. And I think it's up to the children who are survivors to start to speak, as well as our own children. I want to make one more comment and then begin my presentation. I am very, very proud that our oldest daughter made Aliyah with her 3 children 14 years ago. And we try to, our granddaughter is a nutritionist specializing in children, diet, and autism. Our grandson is in Madá as well as in university. And the third one is still in the Army. We meaning our entire family, I have 2 more children, go to Israel on a very regular basis, and I'm fully expecting that our youngest will make Aliyah as well. So now here's my story. I am all of these people because during my lifetime, for various reasons, I lived under 4 different names. I'll start with Eva Rosenberg. Rosenberg was my father's name, and as will become clear later, I will tell you why I did not take that name. So when you see Slovakia, okay, I was born in Czechoslovakia, which in 1992 became Slovakia. In the next slide, in the next picture, this is my family. My mother had a wonderful father, my maternal grandfather. They were Hasidim, and my grandfather was considered to be the most honest person in town. And the proof was that when the flour for matzah baking came, it was brought to my grandfather and grandmother's house because my grandfather would not accept any bribes. If you were poor, if you were rich, you received the same amount of flour according to the size of your family. This is my grandmother, Berta. My oldest daughter is named for her. And here she is sitting in her backyard. This is in the mid 1930s. And this is a woman, this is a sheitel on her head. And this is a woman who is the mother of 6 children. My aunts and uncles decided to leave the Hasidic way. My aunt Adele and Hannah here, teacher, violinist, my uncle, dentist. These 2 uncles owned a men's haberdashery store. None of them survived. Everybody in my family was murdered. And when I say murdered, I'm not speaking only of the Nazis from Germany. I'm speaking about the Slovakian Nazis, the Ukrainian Nazis, the Polish Nazis, because Hitler could not have done what he did without collaborators. Now, one point about my grandfather and my grandmother, which I will probably repeat. They were on the very last transport to Auschwitz. And although they were only in their early 60s, it was reported to my mother after the war that they immediately gave away their food to the younger people because they knew they had no chance of surviving. So let's move on then. And this is my mother, Julia, or Julie, Julishka. In many of these Slavic languages and in Polish, the SHKI is a term of endearment. My mother was the oldest of the siblings and therefore was expected to remain at home and take care of her parents, to marry, but to remain at home. So this was my mother, Julishka. And this was the back of their house. There was a river back there. And this was the back of their house. They had a store which sold dry fruits, candies, nuts and so forth. And they weren't rich, they weren't poor, but they were they certainly had enough money for food and for clothing. Okay. Shall we move on? Okay. This is my father's family. And in this family, you see 5 siblings, but there were actually 9. This is my father. He was the second to the oldest, and he was the most scholarly of all. These other brothers and sisters, there were 9 altogether. In this family, only my Uncle Sam with his wife and son survived. Everybody else was murdered, and of course, including my father. Now, I don't know what the next, okay, let's go back to the previous slide, please. Can we go back before? Okay. My father, in 1942, there was an auction in the city of Mijlabritz, where we lived. My father was rounded up in that auction. So I'm kind of going back and forth in history, and was never seen again. And now I'm kind of going back and forth. If we do the next picture, please. This is my mother's wedding in the backyard. And of course, obviously, she was pregnant after she was married. This is my mother's sister. These are my father's relatives, my mother and my Uncle Sam. My Uncle Sam is the one who survived. This was a backyard wedding, and it was in 1940. And my father was deported in 1942. Again, now, this is my grandmother at a much later age, my Uncle Sam, my uncle's brother, my father's brothers and sisters, my mother's brothers and sisters. And in this picture, and this was a backyard wedding, this was my father, my grandfather. And in this picture, you already see armbands, which I think you'll see in the next picture more clearly. So you see, in Western Europe, like Anne Frank, they had stars, but in Eastern Europe, they had armbands. Okay, so my mother's wedding, let's go back. Now, this picture is also very painful. The Nazis in Czechoslovakia and in other places had what they called an auxiliary brigade. As you know, Jews were not allowed to hold many jobs whatsoever. And so there was tremendous poverty. So they were encouraged by the Nazis to join this auxiliary army. These were navy blue coats, navy blue berets. This is my Uncle Zisha. And Zisha was kind of the flamboyant one. He was gorgeous, as my mother would say. The girls lined up to date him. But the reality of this picture is there were no survivors. Not a single one. And I'll show you what happened. This is a Slovakian guard, by the way. They were given shovels and they were told that they were going to do road work. We can go further. So here they are marching. This is my Uncle Zisha. Here they go marching. And in 1941, especially in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, nobody really knew the extent of what was awaiting them. Okay, we can just go on. I don't want to overstep my time. So here they are marching out to work. And this is what they ended up doing: digging ditches, digging roads. This is a Nazi, a German Nazi. And when they became too salary, they were not paid, they were not fed appropriately. And when they became too weak or too ill to continue this work, in quotation marks, they were then shipped off to one of the concentration camps. Okay. Now this picture, okay, let me back up. In Europe at this time, pictures such as the pictures of my aunts and uncles, this picture, they were actually made into postcards. They were printed on cardstock and sent to family all over the world. This picture I actually took from my husband's pictures. This is a picture of the Nazis coming into a city, a town in Romania, and all of the people coming out to greet them, welcoming them as the heroes. And that's how I got this picture. Okay. Now, let's stop here for a second. I told you that my first name was Rosenberg. My second name was Weinberger. When my mother was in the hospital giving birth to me in the city of Humana, and those of you in Lehigh Valley who know Eva Levitt, you probably already know that Eva Levitt and I were born in the same hospital in Humana, Czechoslovakia, 6 months apart. The Gestapo were coming through the wards. There were Greek Orthodox nuns, sisters, nurses, I'm not exactly sure, and they were trying to hide Jewish women for a period of 5 days. A commandant came through, and my mother was on a deportation list. So he said to my mother, Julia Rosenberg, and my mother said, no, Julia Weinberger. And much to her surprise and relief, he went on to the next bed. So now I'm Eva Weinberger. And I'll stop here for a second. In 1944, the war came to Czechoslovakia and Hungary in full force. The end result was the same. In a 6-month period of time, 2/3 of the Hungarian and Slovakian Jews were murdered. My mother, I want to go, this is a little out of sequence. Let's go on. This is what Theresienstadt looked at. Okay. Now, this is what I want to focus on and then go back to the money. When my mother came home from the hospital, she knew that things had to change. So she went to the priest and asked for false papers, which cost quite a bit of money, plus a monthly fee. And this is my grandfather. And because my mother had converted right over here, daughter currently christened and consecrated. Because of this, from 1942 until 1944, my mother was able to keep her parents and her sisters and her brother and me safe. One of my mother's brothers was on the street. He had his papers and he was stopped by a Nazi and told to cross himself. And he crossed himself incorrectly and was immediately shot. The other two brothers ended up in Auschwitz, as did my aunts. I want to go through these very quickly because this came from the American Red Cross Holocaust Tracing Service. So these were the papers from my grandmother. Let's do the next one, okay? And here I am. And here I am. Now you see I'm Eva Weinberger-Rova. Now, this is kind of cute if you think it's cute. I was christened at birth into the Greek Orthodox Church, obviously in Humana in 1942. Well, obviously it was a false paper. When we lived in St. Louis, we were very, very, very close with our rabbi. And so I called him up, being a little bit of a wise guy, and I said, Rabbi, is there a problem that I was christened at birth? He said, not for me. Was there a problem for you? And I said, no, of course not, because these were obviously false papers. Now, I don't know if there's one more. No, okay, let's go back. Okay, now let me speak about this for a little while. The same priest who gave us these papers then turned us in. And my mother kept claiming that the papers were real and that she was a Greek Orthodox person. My mother hid her parents in a root cellar and hid me for a period of about 6 months until we were finally deported in a chimney. Now, I wasn't in the chimney all the time. I was only in the chimney, not only, but I was in the chimney when the patrols would come through. My mother would give me, I was 3 years old, my mother would give me a pacifier, and into the chimney I would go. One day, and my mother says that this is the woman who saved my life. One day, somehow the pacifier got lost, and my mother's best friend went out on the black market, which was very dangerous for a Jew to do, and came back with a pacifier. However, it was Erev Rosh Hashanah, 1944, when we were all found out and we were all sent to what was known as a convening center. Now, this convening center was run by a Rabbi Weiss Mendel, and he did his very best to stop the deportations. And as you know, the argument about why Roosevelt didn't bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz. Anyway, we were there for a period of time, and eventually my grandparents were on the very last transport to Auschwitz. Now, if we can go back to Theresienstadt, please. Okay, and my mother and I, because Auschwitz was full, we were sent to Theresienstadt. And all of you know the history, and so I don't need to go into that. Let's go into the next picture with the money. Okay, back one, please. The money. Okay, there we go. Now, we were on the line waiting to get into Theresienstadt. The Commandant and the SS, they would go up and down the line and take your legitimate money, the currency in Czechoslovakia was kronen, and they would give you what I always refer to as monopoly money, because as you know, Theresienstadt was the model camp, they had a theater, they had this, the Red Cross inspected it. And this is money that I actually have in my possession, which I will give to my children. So we were waiting to get into Theresienstadt, and luck. People say, how did you survive? I say luck. My mother was healthy looking, and if I may say so, I was cute. And the commandant of Theresienstadt, he had a 3-year-old daughter, and the daughter had been born in the area of Theresienstadt. Now imagine this: you have the camp on one side, and then you have a grassy area, and then on the other side you have the housing for the Nazis. So this commandant took my mother and me into his house to be a maid and a playmate for his daughter. We stayed there until the war ended in May of 1945. We were liberated by the Russians, which was a nightmare. And everybody kept saying, Eva, you can't remember. I said, I do remember, because the Russians, the regular Russian army, and please forgive me for sounding prejudicial, was made up of people who couldn't read, who couldn't write, who were very, very living in the previous century. But one of the things that they loved were watches. And they had watches from their wrist all the way up to their elbow. But they didn't know that they had to wind the watches. So when the watches stopped working, they would throw them away and steal another one. And the proof that I was right is in a cookbook, where a survivor's cookbook, where this woman writes about being liberated by the Russians, and the Russians having all of their watches. Now we come to the end of the war, and what happened at the end of the war, everybody went home. Everybody went to their place of origin, because you would go to the trains every single day to see who had come home. And my mother, my cousin Ibby, my mother's first cousin Ibby, and me. And this was taken right after the war. Now you see these two doors here? I want you to know that 1946 to 1947 was probably the happiest year of my life. My mother worked for 2 brothers who lived here. And of course, you can't stay in the same place as 2 men. So we stayed here. And here lived very, very, to me, she was, I see her in front of my eyes, white-haired, short. And she had a daughter who was, who used crutches. And after the morning breakfast and the coal stove would cool down, she would hold her crutches like this and pick me up and put me on the stove. It was nice and warm, it was wintertime, and play with me all day long. But we didn't have any toys, so we played. And she was and this woman was an adult. We played cat's cradle, we played hand games, and she kept me company and was my best friend. But after a year, the Menlovich brothers got a visa to come to go to Canada, and we had to move on. And my mother knew nobody was coming back. So our next stop was Bratislava, where My mother wanted to go to Australia, but nobody wanted us. Nobody wanted us to be with them. I thought my computer was plugged in, but just give me a moment, please. But nobody wanted us. We were a liability. To have a woman and a small child. I was very cute here, actually. A woman and a small child, we were a liability. So from Bratislava, we moved on, and we finally found my father's older brother in the city of Lučenec. And we lived with them for 2 years. And you can go on to the next picture. Now, this is the picture that was in the publicity. And I always like to look at this picture because you see this bow, it wasn't mine. We didn't have bows after the war. It belonged to the photographer. And I have a few friends who are also child survivors. We all have the same bow. Okay, you go on. And this is my cousin David. He was then Ivan, and he now lives in Israel, in Tel Aviv. And the interesting thing is, he's still, okay, I am 79, he is 81. He's still annoyed with me that he had to take me to kindergarten every day. So you can see that he is the favored one, and here I am. My uncle had been a mining engineer, so he was very familiar with the Tatras Mountains, and they found a cave in the Tatras Mountains and spent the war years there being taken care of by the resistance forces. Okay, we can go on. Now, what to do with my mother? My mother had to get out of Europe, and nobody was going to help us get out of Europe. So my Aunt Sadie, actually my grandmother's sister who had come to America, said, you should marry this man, Sam Judd. Now, Sam Judd was a generation older than my mother and had previously been married to my mother's cousin. So Sam Judd came to Czechoslovakia. This is in the city of Lučenec. And I want you to know selective memory. I can tell you what I ate. I can tell you what I wore. I have no memory of this man whatsoever. This is my Uncle Sam, my Aunt Irene, of course, my mother, my cousin David, and myself. So I'm not a little kid. I have no memory of this man whatsoever. Go ahead. He took my mother, he married my mother and took her to the United States and left me in the care of my aunt. And you can see my face. This was my general attitude towards life in those days. I'm sorry to say I was treated very badly. I was a lefty, and for 2 hours a day, I had my left hand tied behind my back so that I would learn how to write with my right hand. I was never allowed in my cousin David's room because it was sacred. And last but not least, I had to eat the food that they gave me. And the food was fine, except I do not like cooked carrots. Never did, never will. A cooked carrot has never touched my lips. But one day, peas and carrots were served, and I refused to eat them. And therefore, I was segregated from the family for 3 days and I was served the same peas and carrots over and over and over again. My aunt was afraid that I would starve, and she couldn't explain that to my mother, so they finally gave in. Sherry, I don't know what I'm doing on time, so tell me.
Maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, very good. So my mother married Sam Judd, and for whatever reason, he took my mother to America, which was logical, but he wouldn't take me or couldn't take me. I still don't know. So I stayed behind for 6 months in the care of my aunt and uncle. And this is my green card, which is still green. And here I am. And all of a sudden, we were going to Bratislava. We were going to these doctors, and I was getting these smallpox vaccinations, which you got here. And then one day, my uncle and my aunt say to me, "We're going to Prague." I thought, great, an experience. We went to the airport, and this is very interesting. When we got to the airport and they told me I was getting on this plane, they weighed me to be sure that the weight on my green card matched my weight, because children were known to be very good smugglers because they didn't know what they were carrying. Anyway, my aunt and uncle took me to the airport, saw me get on the plane by myself, said, "Don't bother anybody on the plane. Don't talk to anybody. Try not to go to the bathroom. Be good. Behave yourself. So long." And there I was on the plane, and I had this little bouquet of flowers for my mother. And the plane tipped, the vase spilled. This terrible flight attendant grabbed my flowers and started yelling at me. And 2 refueling stops, and 36 hours later, I arrived in America. And believe it or not, there was still a head tax that had to be paid for me. Now, my stepfather's name was Judd, which is how that last name comes in, because he registered me in school. Got to Idlewild Airport, and it was decided that my mother would be too emotional to come into the airport. And so they sent one of Sam Judd's sons. Now, they had indeed sent me a picture, and I was told that this person was going to meet me. Well, this person comes over to me and he says, "Jean," and I look at him and I look at the picture, and they don't match. I wasn't stupid, and I must have had some kind of instinct for self-preservation. I ran away. I ran down the corridor, and they had to send the flight crew after me. The picture was 10 years old. And they finally caught me. They finally convinced me that this was the person. And they took me outside of Idlewild, and there was my mother waiting for me in a cab. Now, fast forward from one person. Do you have the wedding picture also? Okay. Fast forward to,
I don't think I do.
okay, well,
No.
okay, well, let's go back to the Army. Okay, this was my family. This is my family, minus a few members. I had a more recent picture. So in 1954, and I'll end with this, Sam Judd died. He was 32 years older than my mother. He died of a heart attack. And my mother and I started school. I mean, we were in school, my mother to learn English and accounting skills, and me, I was in the 3rd grade, and we began the American dream. At the end of my mother's life, my mother was the head of the accounting department of an advertising agency with the corner office on Madison Avenue, Hungarian accent and all. I was in graduate school, had married young, and from 1954 on, we began the American dream of success. And I don't know, I think you have a picture of Eitan, Sherry. No, this is Eitan when he first went into the Army, our daughter Rachel, and I don't know what other pictures you might have. He was a combat engineer. Our other grandson is in Givati, proud Zionists, all of us, and that's my story. Thank you. Is there anything more you want me to say?
No, Gabrielle.
I want to welcome a good friend of mine. His name is Itai. He's from Israel right now, and we met throughout our army service. And he's gonna sing for us two songs. One is Rikma Enoshit Achat, a single human tissue. His most famous performance was the song performed by Chava Alberstein, and the other song is Tishmor Al Ha'olam Yeled, Watch Over the World Child. Itai.
כשאמות משהו ממני, משהו ממני ימות בך, ימות בך. כשתמות משהו ממך בי, משהו ממך בי ימות איתך, ימות איתך. כי כולנו, כן כולנו, כולנו רקמה אנושית אחת חיה, ואם אחד מאיתנו הולך מעימנו, אז משהו מת בנו, ומשהו נשאר איתו. אם נדע איך להרגיע, איך להרגיע את האיבה, אם רק נדע, אם נדע להשתית את זעמנו על אף עלבוננו, נאמר סליחה, אם רק נדע. כי כולנו, כן כולנו, כולנו רקמה אנושית אחת חיה, ואם אחד מאיתנו הולך מעימנו, אז משהו מת בנו, ומשהו נשאר איתו. תשמור לעולם ילד, יש דברים שאסור לראות. תשמור על העולם ילד, אם תראה תפסיק להיות. גיבור של העולם ילד, עם חיוך של מלאכים. תשמור על העולם ילד, כי אנחנו כבר לא מצליחים. תשמור על העולם ילד, אל תגזים במחשבות, כי כמה שתדע יותר ילד, אתה רק תבין פחות. ובשעה מסוימת נסגרות כל הדלתות, וכל אהבה נגמרת, רק אתה ממשיך לטעות. תשמור על העולם ילד, אל תגזים במחשבות, כי כמה שתדע יותר ילד, אתה רק תבין פחות. ובשעה מסוימת נסגרות כל הדלתות, וכל אהבה נגמרת, רק אתה ממשיך לטעות.
Here's the picture you wanted.
This is the picture. This is our one and only granddaughter. This is our son, daughter-in-law, Jonathan, my husband, Albert, myself, Rachel, Yael, Gabriel, Mark, my daughter, Pam, and I'd like to say there are two more grandchildren who were not able to get to Israel for the wedding, and her husband, and my two grandsons in Israel. So thank you, Sherry.
I feel like that's the real blessing.
That is the real blessing. And every time I'm with them and every time we do something together, we don't spend time talking about the Holocaust.
No.
We go to the beach, we do whatever. And fortunately, we have the ability to get to Israel without this pandemic twice a year. And we go October, November, and April, May. So that is, I guess that's our reward for working hard.
And that's sort of where I wanted to open this up for discussion, is if anyone has questions for Eva or even comments that you might want to make, and you can either ask Eva directly, you can put them in the chat, you can put comments in the chat. I'm already seeing comments about how meaningful this story has been for people today. So we'll open it up. If you want to ask a question, I think the best way to do it would, we're all on one page here, so either if you know how to use the raising your hand function, or if you just want to actually raise your hand, I think I can see everybody.
Karen, you have a question?
I see Karen has a question, and
Have to turn on the mic. Okay. Okay. Well, there was a raise the hand function. Where is that?
well, I see your hand. You don't have to use it. You can just talk.
Okay. This is the question to Eva. Have you ever heard of Dorot? It's a journal of the Jewish Genealogy Society. Can you see it?
Yes.
Have you considered submitting your story?
That's a very good question. I've been asked that question before. And I'll be very honest with all of you. Hidden children, child survivors, up until very recently, have been considered to not be survivors. Survivors were only those who were in the camps. Now that they are aging and dying at a very rapid rate, hidden children and child survivors have been asked to step up to the plate. I hate to use that expression, but we've been asked to start speaking. And I've never considered it because I'm still of that generation that wonders, am I a survivor? I was never in a camp. So it's food for thought. Thank you.
Before I call on Elaine Rappaport-Bass, I just want to say also that, you know, child survivors their stories are extremely valuable. And in these days when we are losing that generation of any survivors, we are asking people who are second generation and now third generation to consider how they share their stories as well, because it's very important to keep that story alive. Eva, Elaine.
How did you meet your husband?
Okay, this is a very funny story. If there are two Hungarians in Macy's, they're going to find each other, okay? But that wasn't quite as bad. Albert's aunt sat in front of my mother in the synagogue. We moved to Forest Hills when I was 16. We had lived in a cold water flat before then. I'm 16, I'm 17, I'm 18, and Tante Shari turns to my mother and in Hungarian says, "It's now time for my nephew to meet your daughter." And that's how we met.
I love it. And the rest is history.
And yeah, 59 years later, the rest is history.
Sophie.
Hi, I'm a third generation survivor. My grandpa is actually here. He's under my grandma's name, but he's also a child survivor. And I started telling his story 2 years ago. And I went to a Jewish day school, and our senior year, we went to Poland to go and visit the concentration camps. And I was just wondering if you've gone there and seen any, and what your views are on going back.
I have never gone back. My children, my grandchildren, I should say, have gone on March of the Living. I have never gone back because I haven't wanted to go back. It would just reconfirm everything that I know. I do know that in the city where I was born and then where I lived, there are no Jews there anymore. And no, I haven't. I'm happy that my children went. The Israeli group, when they go, they're fearless. They go with their boom boxes and their flags and everything else. And the other reason I haven't gone back is because, unfortunately, the most amount of money that comes into the city where Auschwitz is located is from tourism. And I don't want to be part of that. When my grandchildren have gone, they've each gone with $5, and they've been told that they're expected to bring change home. They bring all their food with them, or they eat in the Chabad house. So no, I've never been back.
Something that made me very uncomfortable about the tourist aspect was how I felt like they had turned Auschwitz into a tourist site, selling drinks and food. And I went with my whole class, and that was something that my friends and I found to be so disrespectful and very weird to see.
I agree. And then the whole controversy about trying to build, I believe it was a convent on part of the grounds. I totally agree. It is not a tourist attraction. It is an attraction that it is a place where everybody should be crying.
So one of the things that we had discussed when we were planning this was sort of where to take this, what to take away from this, and so I want us to be able to think about how these stories affect us. Many of us have heard these stories as long as we can remember. But I think it's time for us to start thinking about how they affect us. Why do we need to hear them, and what can we take away from them? And along with that, we need to consider ways in which we can use these stories to help better the world, better our Jewish communities, better ourselves. And so I don't know if anyone has any comments or thoughts about that, or Eva, if you do, before we conclude today.
Well, before I say anything, there is a lady on my screen whose name is Karen. I believe she's muted, and she's had her hand up several times.
Karen, go ahead and you can unmute yourself.
Basically, Eva, you will enjoy this. I will say that my son, I am a survivor. My son did a lot of research, and he submitted my story, which I helped with after he did it. But this is for Eva. The bow.
Oh,
See it?
Eva, she's showing you the bow. Can you see that?
Yes, now I can see it, yes.
That was taken in the United States, but that was the time of the bow. And the other thing that I would like to say is that your recollections are excellent. I have recollections, but I have blanked everything out, so that when I go and I have presented at times, I need the dates and everything on an index card because I just don't remember.
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Well, I think what you're saying is correct, because we have selective memory. I'm very fortunate in that I have a lot of pictures, because as for two reasons. One, my uncle was never in a camp. And two, my mother, well, I should say my grandmother had two sisters living in the United States. And so annually, as I mentioned before, these professional pictures were on cardstock and they were sent to the United States. So therefore, I do have pictures, which I'm very fortunate to have.
Elaine?
The people, the Holocaust, the people who say that the Holocaust never occurred. I think that's why it's so important for Eva to tell your story over and over again.
Thank you. Karen,
Yes,
may I ask where you are from?
Vienna.
Vienna. Thank you.
And my mother basically saved my father. I mean, my father was Romanian and his quota was unbelievable. He was picked up. He was a businessman. He went to Dachau. My mother saved him by attempting to have him go to other countries. The only open countries were Shanghai, Argentina, Palestine. Palestine had the nearest date of availability, so she went to Dachau, showed that he could go, leave the country, and he was released. So he ended up going to Israel. My mother then got me on the kinder transport. I was on the next to last kinder transport, and then she got herself out by going to Italy and then coming to the States. And that's how we made it out.
Thank you.
Adina?
Yeah. And I am a second generation survivor. My mother was born in Belgium and she was her family actually was on the run for a long time, but for some of the time she was with a Christian family. I didn't raise my hand to tell her story, but really to say my grandmother did not speak at all. My mother did not speak until very, very recently. And when she goes, my family lives in Israel. When she goes to speak in front of groups, she doesn't do it on a regular basis, but every once in a while, she doesn't speak about herself. She talks about her family, like you did with the pictures, and what she remembers of what she knew of her family, and mostly of what my grandmother wrote, because she did write later on in her life. And I really appreciate, Shari, when you said, okay, it's time for us to take over now, and it's time for us to do some processing, what this is, how we are doing, what this means to us, what it means to us. And I want to say, I find that it's not easy for me to answer that question at all. I grew up in Israel. I heard Holocaust my whole life. I have a book in family, a family book of that. I don't know, 3/4 of the people in this book were perished in the Holocaust, and I go through that with my kids. But I feel like even just the fact that we are real people and we have families and we can trace our family roots to those people, and we know their names and where they came from and where they died, and we can pass this on and say these things, that's enough. For now, that's enough to just keep on making those statements.
Interestingly enough, my husband was born in Belgium. He was born in Antwerp, and my late father-in-law was a diamond merchant. And fortunately, within about 2 to 3 months of the Nazis invading Belgium, my father-in-law went up and down the seashore where their summer house was. and got them on a ship. And the next thing they knew, they were in Morocco. They were safe.
And Eva, thank you very much for sharing your story. Very moving. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know that there are several people here who have taught in the community, have shared their stories, whether they are survivors, whether they are second generation or third generation. It runs the range as I'm looking on the screens here. And if there is anyone who wants help crafting a story, that's available, and it's really, really needed. And while that's not necessarily the reason we did this today, it's definitely a consideration. Eva, thank you really so much for sharing your story, and it's so meaningful, and it's so meaningful to hear it, and you share so well, and I think we're privileged and honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. And what I will say about the Lehigh Valley community, we've been here about 4.5 years now, is that I admire the total Jewish commitment to Israel, to Jewish Federation, to the day school, and that's very meaningful for my husband and myself. Thank you.
Amit, do you want to close us out?
First, I would like to thank Itai also for the music, for the very special music you played for us. Eva, thank you so much for telling us your story. I think everyone here was moved. And as I told you before, when we spoke before today, that we would love to have you visit Yoav, and that's the same for anyone in Lehigh Valley when you come to Israel. We're all part of the same partnership family, and we would love to have you guys visit. So thank you for this very special time, and I feel just that much closer to you guys.
Thank you. And Bezrat Hashem, we will be in Israel as soon as we can get there.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending.